Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the second session in the Cooling Data Room. My name is William Elliott from White Rook Cyber. I'll be chairing today's session. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker today from Recorded Future, Peter Watson. Just a quick bio for Peter. Peter is a cybersecurity specialist with over 20 years' experience in a range of roles spanning multiple security domains. He holds Certified Information Security, System Security Professional, CISP, and GIAC Certified Penetration Tester certifications. In addition to security intelligence, other focus areas over the past 10 years have included network forensics and malware analysis. Thank you very much, Peter. Looking forward to this talk.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to dive into Info Stealer Malware today. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that. When I talk to customers, some have heard of it, some aren't really aware of how prevalent it is now, how many of the credentials that are used for attacks are derived from Info Stealer Malware as a source. I think, traditionally we've had the database breaches, credential dumps available on, Have I Been Pwned and the various intelligence platforms out there. But, they tend to be pretty low fidelity credentials. They're often not corporate credentials, they're often personal. They tend to be reused, so threat actors gather old data breaches, zip them up into a new file and leak them on a forum for their own notoriety. But in terms of a data source that is useful for people to actually do something actionable with, those sort of the credential dumps aren't really a great source. Info Stealer Malware, however, is another thing, and it's growing. So I thought it might be topical to talk about it and give you a bit of background on it. Sort of assuming here something like a zero knowledge on Info Stealers, so I'm sort of starting at the basics. You're all probably familiar with Zeus. It was one of the early banking Trojans, and it itself was an information stealer, and it was sort of the first iteration, I guess, of the Info Stealer malware. It was the first iteration of Stealer malware, and the Info Stealer malware was a later iteration of that. Of course, Zeus was had high notoriety. It was infecting people's machines and phones and stealing banking logins primarily. And then that was, exfiltrated to the Zbot botnet, and then of course there were some very famous successors to Zeus, Quackbot, Ursnif, Imitet, Trickbot, and so I guess the Info Stealers have evolved since then as a subset of those remote access Trojans. And we're seeing a growth in their use by cyber criminals, not just script kiddies and hacktivists. Now there's people, the high-end gangs, like the ransomware gangs, are using credentials derived from Info Stealers. So it's a massive market now. If you spend any time on the dark web or any of the cyber-focused channels on Telegram, for example, you'll see advertisements for Info Stealers. Some of the more common ones that probably most people have heard of are ones like Redline Stealer and VDAR, Raccoon. But there are literally thousands of different Info Stealers out there, and they all have a somewhat similar capability, but like any malware, there's quite a broad range of capabilities across the suite of them. They all basically are designed to steal data and exfiltrate it to a command and control server. They are so prevalent now that the amount of data that we're seeing daily, credentials stolen from this information, is quite mind-boggling. But you can see the marketing here. There's a post here from a high-tier forum called XSS, where the threat actors advertising StealC, which is a newer Info Stealer, and it's like a business, like any other business. They advertise, they try and pitch their product, they pitch the advantages of it. just like any other business. Threat actors will often post pictures of their panels. So a lot of the info stealers are now marketed as malware as a service. And so that's, it's a lower barrier to entry for people who want to access the data that they're stealing. And, as a result, there's really been this explosion in growth. But this is a typical admin panel from one of these Info Stealer malware. This is the Mars Stealer. And it's really set up for users to just basically push a button and just start harvesting the credentials as they come in. And they pay a rate for like a week's access, a month's access, whatever it is. They're given access to this panel and they're just left to their own devices. Again, to the marketing, I didn't have to do a lot of searching to find all these screenshots from different sources, some dark web, some Telegram, and you can see, like I said, just like any business, they're advertising, you should use our product, it's better than the rest. So it really is out there. This is a closer look at some of the data that info stealers target. So it could be as simple as keystrokes, but it's more typically enumerating all the user profiles on an operating system. It's looking for browser stores. The credentials and the passwords from browser stores are a key source of data for them, as are the cookies. And as we'll see in a few more slides, the cookies are a really valuable asset because they can help threat actors bypass some of the other controls. These samples are from a couple of sandbox detonations of Raccoon Stealer and Redline Stealer. And you can just see some of the behavioural analysis that the stealers are exhibiting. But they're typical looking for all the user profile data in the browsers. They're scraping crypto wallets. They're looking at anything that's PII related that might be useful to a threat actor. A little more detailed look at some of that data. There's a few things I wanted to point out here. This Stealer log I'm showing is from Raccoon Stealer, and just below on the left at the bottom, the green box at the lowest down, I've got a cookie expiration date highlighted. So in this case, this Stealer log's got credentials to live.com, and this cookie expires next year. And this is gold for the threat actors because they can use some other tooling and this cookie to bypass things like multi-factor authentication. So it's not just the usernames and the passwords that are the issue. These logs contain also the full clear text password. They typically contain information about the machine that was the target, so that'll include the OS details. It will include the computer name, their source IP address, other environment sort of based data from that user's computer. So, as a threat actor, you've got all this at your fingertips, and typically they have a long list of different authorization URLs that the password store is providing access to, which means they may well be able to log into any of the same systems that user is logging into day to day, just by using this data. The monetization of this data historically has been on some of these dark web markets like the Russian market, the Too Easy Shop, and Genesis Store. And like this is a screenshot of one log. And literally, if you look on the Russian market daily, there are tens of thousands of these. You can see a bit of information here. You can see the source ISP. You can see the stealer family name. You've got a bit of a tree diagram of the user data that's been stolen and the authorization URLs that have been accessed. But this data doesn't give you enough for attribution, so they often don't give you a username or a user email address. Even if they do, you definitely won't see the passwords in this data. So, we, amongst other intelligence vendors, do scrape these Russian markets, and they're a good way to proactively, to warn people that there are credentials out there that they perhaps should care about. What it doesn't really help them do, though, is mitigate the risk, because these are already there for sale, so they may be purchased anyway. Plus, there's not typically enough detail in the logs to determine who the source user was. The detail is in the logs, but they only expose a certain amount on the markets because they're trying to sell it, right? So the markets themselves aren't, or collecting data from the markets themselves isn't terribly useful. It gives you some situational awareness, but it doesn't give you all the detail you need to mitigate the actual threat. The Genesis store is a very well-known dark web market that was very sophisticated. They even had their own browser called Genesis Security, which you could load these bots, these logs into, and basically emulate a user. So it was basically emulating a user's environment from wherever you were in the world by loading the data collected by their bots and allowing you, so any systems that were trying to identify a source machine would have seen this as a trusted source machine. And they were recently taken down by law enforcement just in April this year. And they were one of the largest markets for this and one of the most mature markets. I guess the guy's OPSEC fell down somewhere and he just got too greedy and they got seized. And it was a joint effort. I know the AFP, you can see that logo there. It was a joint effort globally to bring this down. But like any of these websites, there'll be other ones that pop up to replace it. It's always this cat and mouse. Sorry, I thought I was on this slide already. But there's still plenty of sources out there for this data. One thing that's changed in the last couple of years is the monetization by initial access brokers leveraging data from Info Stealer logs. So historically, the Info Stealer logs would infect home machines and they give people access to anything that home user was accessing. But since the pandemic, that's driven the growth in the remote workforce. More and more people have been logging onto corporate assets from home machines that are infected with Info Stealer logs. And that means potentially high-value credentials for the more sophisticated threat actors. So the initial access brokers have kind of grown now, and they're a broker, as the name implies, right? They sit in the middle. They get access to the malware Info Stealer logs in a wholesale way. They comb those for high-value credentials like VPN, RDP, anything that logs into a corporate asset, and they then on-sell that to on the high-tier, usually the Russian-speaking high-tier markets like Exploit and XSS, to the ransomware gangs. And this is an example here of a couple of those posts. And on the right here I've got an example targeting an Australian customer. This is typically all that you get to see with these posts. They're very careful not to give too much away. The revenue figure of 20 million is usually derived from Zoom info. The threat actors will look up a company and see what its annual revenues are. And then they put the credentials up for auction. So Blitz means just a one-off payment. If you want to skip the auction and just buy this credential, it'll be $1,000. So these are widely used by gangs like Lockbit and any of the other sophisticated threat actors as their initial access vector. And so this, what's started out as a landscape that was really just targeting home users is now a real concern for corporations because their corporate access credentials may be out there. And this graph demonstrates some of that. So, I mean, the data in most of my slides is from our particular flavour of identity intelligence, but this is representative of what the Info Stealer logs do across the board. You can see all the different authorization technologies on the left here that we have Info Stealer logs for in this time window of, what is it? I think this was a month's worth. So it's not just people logging into, eBay. It's web admin panels. It's Citrix. It's anything there that could be corporate and can be leveraged. Like all malware, phishing is still the primary delivery mechanism for Info Stealer malware, and it can be hidden. Typically, these are only small payload pieces of malware, but they are obfuscated usually by maybe using a dropper to encrypt the data as part of a larger archive, so it might be Office documents. A key attack vector too is downloading of cracked software, free versions of software. This recent campaign is one example where they were able to get visibility up in the Google Ads rank to this fake website, and it had Mail Stealer packed in with any of the software that you downloaded from that website. So, they're always being creative with this stuff. This is some statistics on, you can see the file names. I don't know how well you guys can see, but basically the file names on the right there are all exe packages of different, and most of them are like cracked or free versions of software of some sort. So, the home users will tend to download stuff for their own machines, but it could end up giving someone access to your corporate environment. So I think it's not just the pandemic that has fueled the growth in stolen credentials. We've tracked a growth of about sixfold in the last year for over 2022, but I've just cut and pasted a few other headlines, recent headlines from all different sources, that this is a real thing. This growth is real. It's being reported across many different vendors and technical blogs, and it's in line with what we're seeing and what we're tracking as well. So this is leading to the growth in initial access brokers as well. But I think apart from the remote workers, the malware as a service model has made this more accessible to more people. So that's another trigger for the growth. Session cookies to bypass MFA is the key reason now we're seeing higher value targets like corporations. Some of the new variants will even scrape data from MFA apps. There's other bypass techniques for MFA as well, including MFA fatigue attacks. But as I've already mentioned, the targets here are basically the ransomware gangs and the affiliates that operate that ransomware. And there's been a spike in initial access listings as a result of the spike in Info Stealer listings. The bottom graph is showing cookies. The blue is malware with cookies, steal logs with cookies. Compared to the data. So something like 30 to 40% of credentials have cookies in them. And, cookie bypass techniques are well documented and well known. This is just one example that you can get tools, Chrome extensions that let you insert and modify cookies. Some of the offensive security tools like Mimikatz can decrypt them. And it's just a matter of getting those session cookies, proxying those and bypassing MFA. This is a very kind of different bypass technique that was reported by CISA late last year, I think, where threat actors just brute forced the user's password on a new device. So it was a new device enrolment. And of course the default setting for this particular identity vendor was allow re-enrollment of devices. Once they got in, they then exploited the system using Print Nightmare, and then they tweaked the identity solution to just black hole the MFA calls. And this particular identity solution, if it loses contact with that server, its core server, it fails open. So basically everyone was logging in for free. So, and you sort of look at this and I heard a couple of chuckles, and yeah, it's like hard to believe that there's companies out there, but if you're not familiar enough with your particular identity provider and it happens to have a default fail open, it can happen to anyone, right? So it's just another, the threat actors are so creative. Of course, the MFA fatigue attacks are a more recent phenomenon, I guess, and that's just simply, again, just bombarding users with notifications until they get sick of it and accept one, and it's been effective. SIM swapping is a kind of an older or a more established way too of bypassing MFA. So MFA is not the answer in itself, and neither is antivirus or endpoint solutions, and I'm not having a crack at any endpoint vendors here. This is just data from the logs, and you can see Windows Defender at the top. So this is all Info Stealer data and the Info Stealers, amongst other things, tell you what antivirus systems were running on the computer when they stole data from it. And it's not uncommon in the logs to see multiple systems loaded, but they do a very good job of evading detection. So you can't really rely on that either. This is why they're growing. I think to mitigate this, it's some of the usual network security hygiene things, but really you shouldn't be allowing people access corporate assets from home machines, period, if you can make that work, because this is really the primary attack vector. These users on their home machines just surfing anything, downloading anything, and then logging into your network when they're infected with Info Stealer malware. Of course, phishing awareness is always a good idea because that's the number one vector for all malware. And just other sensible measures, right? Enforcing installation of the security updates, content filtering just to limit the websites that the browser can reach. But, I think this whole thing of session cookie lifetimes, if you at least consider changing anything that serves content in your environment that you have control over, that is especially critical data, just think about cookie lifetimes. Maybe just changing those to a day or two instead of 6 months or a year might protect you from a ransomware attack. As simple as that. And then just finally, there is the capability now to proactively protect against this, and that is, essentially plug into your SIEMs or your SOARs with a source of identity intelligence that is giving you information on credentials that are stolen from your corporation. This is the data that is available in sort of a wholesale way, if you like. So unlike the credential dumps that are out there, and unlike the Info Stealer data that's on the dark web markets, once it's hit those markets, it's kind of almost too late. This is data that is the raw logs, so it's before it's hit the markets for sale. And as a result, it's high efficacy data. It has all the user's details in. So if you're constantly monitoring with an identity intelligence solution for those credentials, you can easily automate the process through SOAR or SIEM to actually mitigate, force a password change on the user and mitigate the attack up front. And that's all I have. I'm not sure how I am for time, Will.
Running well, Peter. I'll just go to the audience now. Is there any questions for Peter? None there. On that note then, Peter, thank you. On behalf of the AusCERT Organising Committee, we'd like to thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
Please accept this limited edition super valuable Back to the Future Monopoly.
Thanks, wow. Thank you.
Thank you.